Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another remote lecture for the Introduction to the Old Testament, or Introduction to the Hebrew Bible, if you prefer, as I do. And today we're going to be talking about the divided kingdoms and early prophecy. So, looking at the early layers of prophecy in the Hebrew Bible, looking at prophets like Elijah and Elisha. So, lots to cover today. I'm going to leave some things, of course, for the Thursday session, but we're going to go ahead and get through this rapidly. Now, a few things. First and foremost, we're going to start by looking at this rough timeline, and you have a more detailed timeline that I've uploaded to Moodle that is very important. But basically, here's what we've got going on. According to the Bible, you have the united monarchy under David and Solomon, including the construction of the first temple, and we left off before the exam, just right around here at the end of Rehoboam's life and the beginning of this divided kingdom where you have Israel and you have Judah. So from there, you basically wind up with a series of kings in the northern kingdom and a series of kings in the southern kingdom, and it goes back and forth throughout 1st and 2nd Kings to discuss the various reigns of these kings and also prophets who are basically going back and forth with these kings over time. So a few things that we should talk about in terms of how the geography, the borders of Israel changed as these kingdoms divided. And again, this is according to the Hebrew Bible's version. In the Hebrew Bible, you have David's empire, Solomon's empire, basically, which it's a bit extreme to call it an empire because basically these are kingdoms that are almost certainly subsidiary kingdoms under Egypt. So Egypt is really in control of the whole region, but this is a kingdom that has some autonomy but is basically dependent on Egypt through this whole period. And their basic hegemony, their rule, runs from the border of Egypt, which is right about here, and again, Mount Sinai, according to the Hebrew Bible, is probably over here in Midian somewhere. But basically, Egypt starts right around here, and then Judah is at the border of Egypt and works its way forward. And the kingdom of Israel, this united kingdom, basically controls this whole region all the way up to the Euphrates River. And just a little bit, not so much here in Phoenicia, where Tyre and Sidon have their own independent kingdoms, and there's Lebanon up here as well. So you've got a few things there that are a little bit different. They have their own thing: Phoenicia, Lebanon, etc. So what we have after Solomon is a little bit different. After Solomon, you have the kingdom of Judah is basically limited to essentially to this area initially, and then sort of gets whittled down over time to where Edom casts off Judahite rule, Moab casts off Judahite rule, Ammon casts off both Judahite and Israelite rule over this period, and Philistia gains some independence. So this whole region, which is under the control of the Judahite kings initially, ultimately those various regions gain independence, and you wind up with just this little sliver, this little square of Judah that's basically around the size of, in terms of north to south, of the Dead Sea, and then works its way not quite to the coast because you have Philistia that is now independent over here. And then you have the northern kingdom of Israel, which is this area, and it runs on both sides of the Jordan, runs to the water, to the Mediterranean here, and then works its way around in this fashion. So that's all important to understand, and it's also important to understand that the northern kingdom here not only is larger in terms of land mass, it also is significantly more prosperous. It's a better piece of real estate, essentially. If you think about it, if you would rather grow, whether you got to imagine whether you would rather grow crops, for example, near a nice freshwater lake, in the plain of Jezreel here, that's pulling off of that, and there's some nice tributaries and water over here, or down the whole Jordan River, that whole river basin, and all of the various things that you can do with that water. You've got all of those advantages. You've got some again, some plains and all of these things where you can grow things. The Galilee surrounding the Sea of Galilee, which is really just a freshwater lake, has a lot of good agricultural land. There's good pasture land in Gilead. You see these rivers again. There's a lot of fertility and a lot of advantages in terms of the land up in this region here. Whereas in the south, in Judah, the water that they're bordering is the Dead Sea. You're not growing anything near that. That is the most salinated, the saltiest water on earth. And so at that point, that's not going to be very helpful. And then as you get inland, it's much rockier, more mountainous terrain. It's not as suitable for agriculture. It's just not as suitable in general for a prosperous, to be a prosperous breadbasket. So this is basically the backwoods. This is the boondocks. This is the sticks. And this is much more civilized, prosperous civilization. This is more West Virginia. This is more Virginia. That's basically what you got. So from that point forward, Israel is really the more prosperous and larger and more powerful nation. Judah, less so. And again, it's a simple matter of geography and the advantage of things like the fertile areas like the Jezreel Valley and the Galilee. So at the same point, the big difference, the other big difference is that in the south, in Judah, they're able to maintain the Davidic dynasty, or at least the sense of the Davidic dynasty. There's some debate about that, but we'll just go with the biblical account here, in that they're able to maintain the Davidic dynasty for hundreds of years, the same kingly line that rules over Judah for hundreds of years. And that allows an amount of political stability in this region that it helps compensate to some degree for some of the disadvantages that you have versus the north, where there's more resources, there's more access to prosperity, there's a lot of things up here, but they're a much more divided group. Because you've got multiple tribes, you've got multiple interests, you've got multiple regions, essentially. I mean, Galilee and Jezreel are different regions. Gilead is a different region. The region of the hill country of Samaria is a different region, whereas Judah is basically a region of its own, essentially. Compared to what you see up in the north, you've got a lot more heterogeneity up in the north. And anytime you have diversity, you're going to have more. It's going to be more difficult to establish unified political rule and unified, basically unity in general. Diversity and unity tend to be at odds. So basically, and the other thing is that because of its advantage as a piece of real estate, this was also something that other kingdoms, especially as you get into Mesopotamia here, as you get some of these, like the Assyrians coming from up here, they're much more interested in controlling this area than they are this area. So that also makes them more appealing to potential enemies. There's more to fight over. So essentially, you have a bit of a difference in terms of political stability that you can see here in the genealogy that I've provided on the handout. And you can see these dotted lines represent a change in dynasty. And generally what that means is you're going to have this person, the person who opens the new dynasty is going to kill all of the men, all of the male descendants of the prior ruling dynasty. So Jeroboam has Nadav, who then is killed by Baasha, and then Baasha has Elah, who then is killed by Zimri, and all of the house of Baasha is killed by Zimri, and then Zimri manages to rule for how long? 4 days? So, that's 7 days. Actually, I'm sorry, 7 days. A little rusty on that, but Zimri rules for a week before Omri, who's the key general of the military, manages to swing them in his favor. If you're gonna engage in a military coup, it's good to be in charge of the military, and Omri wins their favor and he takes over here. So you can see that, it's not exactly a lasting business to be a king in the northern kingdom of Israel. So you have Omri, Ahab, Ahaziah dies, and then Jehoram, who actually is the next son there, manages to rule. So from there you get to Yehu, and Yehu actually manages to have 4 generations on the throne before his great-grandson Zechariah gives way to Shallum, who gives way to Menachem, who then has Pekahiah, etc. So you have a large number of dynasties. Really, the longest lasting is 4 generations here with Yehu, and the others really don't last more than 2 generations, and that's a lot of political instability in the north. In the south, you have it's a little bit different. In the south, you have Solomon, who has Rehoboam, and then you have Aviyah, you have Asa, you have Jehoshaphat, you have Jehoram, you have Ahaziah, you have Jehoash, and all the way down, this is all of these in green are from the house of David. So there's a lot going on here in terms of this, but basically there's a lot of political stability where it just goes down from father to son for generation after generation, and that allows a significant bit of a lot more political stability and a little bit more prosperity than they probably should have had relative to the north, based on the lands themselves. Now, there's a couple of things that we should talk about as well in terms of just thinking about the Deuteronomistic history or the former prophets here, in that most of the time histories are written by the victors. They're written by the stronger people. Well, one of the interesting things here is that in the Deuteronomistic history, in the former prophets, it's actually the partisans of the weaker southern kingdom, the people from Judah, who get to write the final history, partly because Israel is destroyed first. And so as a result, we get the bias that comes through in this is biased in favor of the weaker kingdom. That's an important thing to remember as you're reading through this. And one of the things one of the major goals that the former prophets have is they're trying to show that Israel's disloyalty to Adonai and their leaving of the Davidic line is what led to their destruction. But at the same point, we know historically that Israel's destruction was partly due to just simply it being the stronger kingdom and superior real estate. And we also know, and as the authors of the former prophets knew, that Judah was also, it only lasted, not quite 150 years more, which is a reasonable amount of time. But, on the cosmic scale, on the grand scale, Judah shared the same fate, essentially, as Israel. So I gave you a table of significant events in all of this that basically led to the dissolution of the northern kingdom and the deportation of many of its people. And you can see basically these are the events that come from the time of the monarchy. This is important. This is all stuff that I think you're going to want to know. These are basically things that you'll be able to add as you study, and we'll be fitting some of the various things we'll talk about into this chart. We'll be discussing these various things from this chart in more detail, though we won't be returning to the chart itself. This will be something that'll be helpful to come back to as a reminder of some of those key events. So that's an important thing as well. So a few things here. We're going to move into the Elijah and Elisha narratives. These are very important narratives, and it's interesting because these are the books of Kings, but Elijah and Elisha get a large percentage of the books of Kings focused on them and not on actual kings. Once again, this is the former prophets, right? It's focused. It's really more interested in showing the way that the prophets work than it is to talk about the politics of things. And really, when it's talking about the kings, it's talking about them in terms of political benefit, in terms of their religious faithfulness and their religious contributions, what we would call religious, rather than their political stuff for the most part. Now, as far as what happens here, about 50 years after Solomon's death, so going back to our chart here, about 50 years after Solomon. So you have Solomon dies, you have Jeroboam, and then you have Nadav. About 50 years after that, you have Baasha, and here we are, 50 years after Solomon. We have Elah, the son of Baasha, takes over, right? But Omri ultimately wins the military coup at that point and ascends to the throne of the north. And he's the one that establishes Samaria as the new capital of Israel. And I'm redundant there by saying it's the new capital of Israel at Samaria. Samaria has a couple advantages when we're looking at Samaria. And actually, I'm going to pull up another map here that will be helpful. So let's go ahead and pull up a new map. So when we pull this up, I'm going to zoom in here a little bit. And I'm going to do we're going to pull up the divided kingdoms. So this is what we see. Now Judah here, this is early in the process. But here's Samaria. This is the Samaria that that Omri makes the capital of the northern kingdom. Prior to that, the northern kingdom, you had the shrine cities in Bethel and Dan, and then you also had the chief cities were Shiloh and Shechem. And Shechem seems to be probably, Tirzah also. These three central cities were the core cities for the ruling of Israel. Tirzah was one of the chief cities, but he moves it to Samaria in the middle of the hill country here. And one of the reasons for that is its proximity to this King's Highway that's running down here, which is a major trade route, which runs through Megiddo, which is one of the reasons why Megiddo was a frequent site of battle. This is, by the way, Har Megiddo, the hill of Megiddo, or the mountain of Megiddo, is where you get the word Harmageddon or Armageddon from. It's the Greek version, the Greek way of transliterating the mountain of Megiddo. And this is an important regional hub because you have the road that runs from Mesopotamia and basically larger Asia through this Near East area, through the Levant, that is, into Egypt and Africa. And it also happens to be a road that branches up and runs into Anatolia and therefore into Europe. So this is where, if you're going to have trade come through this region over land, a large percentage of it is going to run through Megiddo. Now, some is going to run through this Arabian traverse, but most things are actually going to be coming north to south this way through that chief road. And so Samaria is a little closer to that. It's also in this central hill country, centrally located in the prime territory of Israel. And so there's some strategic reasons to put it over there. And you can see Jerusalem is actually less advantageous of a location than Hebron with respect to Judah in terms of central location. And really, Judah kind of gets pared down to that region, as we talked about before. Beersheba being kind of the lowest point of that. And down here, this is straight up wilderness. So that's what's going on. Now, Omri takes over and is super important. He founds Samaria as the new capital of Israel, and he also makes alliances with the Phoenicians to the north, so the Phoenicians here, and also he makes other alliances, but the primary one is to the Phoenicians by marrying his son Ahab, or Achav, to the daughter of the king of Tyre, a woman who you've almost certainly heard the name of, Jezebel. She doesn't have a good review in the Bible. She's not well thought of. But basically, he establishes a nice trade relationship and an alliance with Phoenicia over and against Aram. Aram is the big opponent of Israel in those days. And so it's basically they've got a marriage alliance with his son Ahab and Jezebel. Now, Omri was super successful. In terms of the archaeology of the period, Omri was the most successful king, was the most powerful king in this region. He was a prosperous, and he was a good military strategist and was very prosperous. And if you look at archaeologically all of the various places that get built up, a lot of these cities and a lot of the fortresses and all of that in the region basically get beefed up and get redesigned, and a lot of things get built in the time of Omri. Super important figure. and was so successful that even after Yehu had taken control of the northern kingdom and had wiped out the descendants of Omri, so the Omride dynasty was over. Even after that, the Assyrians refer to Yehu and his descendants as ruling over the house of Omri. They refer essentially to the northern kingdom as Omri land. So he is a really, really powerful and important king. Now let's take a look at what the biblical authors actually talk about when they talk about Omri. Let's see how much credit they give him. Obviously, he gets a lot of credit, right? He gets a lot of discussion. So the people of Israel were divided into two parts. Half followed Tivni, the son of Ginath. The other half followed Omri. But the people who followed Omri prevailed over the people who followed Tivni, the son of Ginath. And Tivni died, and Omri became king. In the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah, Omri became king over Israel and reigned 12 years. He reigned 6 years at Tirzah, and he bought the hill of Samaria from Shemer for 2 talents of silver, and he built on the hill, and he named the city which he built Samaria, after the name Shemer, the owner of the hill. So he's a powerful enough king that he's actually building a new city, right? This is big time stuff. Omri did evil in the sight of Adonai. He acted more wickedly than all who were before him, because he walked in the way of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and his sons, or in his sins which he made Israel to sin, provoking Adonai, God of Israel, with their idols. Now the rest of the acts which Omri which he did, and with the might which he showed, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? So Omri slept with his fathers, and was buried in Samaria, and Ahab his son became king in his place. That's not a whole lot of information. Omri gets all of 7 verses in the Bible. You would think that if the biblical authors were going to talk about the most important figures, Omri would get chapter after chapter because of his his political power, his pivotal role in making the northern kingdom into a powerful kingdom. But they don't give him much. They're not interested in that. They really only wanted to spend enough time there to condemn his disobedience to Adonai. And then the text spends the rest of its time focusing on Elijah and Elisha in the days of Omri's son and grandson. So this tells you something about what the authors are trying to do. The narrator is not as concerned with who's necessarily politically successful. The narrator is more concerned with showing how faithfulness to Adonai leads to good things. And Omri is kind of a bad example of that, right? More attention is given to how faithful kings are to Adonai than to their political success. And in this case, you don't want to spend a lot of time on Omri, who's not faithful to Adonai, according to the narrator, and then has a tremendous amount of success. That kind of works against the aims of the narrator. It's not what the narrator wants you to take away, so they just kind of, he did some great things, built the city of Samaria after he bought it. A lot of things going on here, but we don't need to really pay attention to him. We'll pay attention to his son. So there you go. Now, Elijah and Elisha are super important to the biblical story and are really influential in the way that things get understood later on. Now, unlike later prophets, unlike the prophets that we're going to start this week after this class, they don't leave any writings of their own. Instead, we just have stories about them. And this is actually a separate block, really, within the Book of Kings. So you get basically the 4 chapters of 17, the 4 chapters of 5 chapters of 1 Kings 17 through 20 through 21, and then the 10 chapters of 1 Kings 1 through 9. That is 9 chapters. I was speaking inclusively, but that's still 9 chapters. Yeah. So 5 chapters and 9 chapters. So you're looking at 14 chapters that stand as a separate block, that they're focused on those prophets rather than the others. And most scholars call those the Elijah-Elisha cycle. The Elijah narrative itself is just 5 shorter stories, and they're all worth reading and studying closely because these are pivotal stories in 1 Kings. The most well-known and the one that has been the most influential is the one in 1 Kings 18. This is the one where Elijah basically pits it's the contest on top of Mount Carmel, where basically Adonai is pitted against Baal, the Canaanite god Baal, to determine who is actually the real God. So if we're going to look at this, what he does is he comes to this northern region here, and we're going to go ahead and get Old Testament sites here. No, I want geography. We're going to go... So you see Carmel here. That's where we're headed. So he goes to Carmel, and actually the easiest way to do this. Not the one I want. We'll just go to Carmel. I won't show you the mountain itself for now, but you have Carmel here in the north. And he goes to this Mount Carmel, which is a key shrine mountain for the god Baal. And he basically from there, and my accordance has crashed, so that's great. From there, he challenges the prophets of Baal to sacrifice together with him. They're going to make a sacrifice, but he says we're gonna offer a sacrifice, but here's how we're gonna tell who the God who's actually the real God, the one that we should be worshiping, the one that we should serve. We're going to check and we're going to test who the real one is by seeing who is actually going to answer by fire. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to make a sacrifice. We're going to sacrifice to this God. We're going to divide up we're going to slaughter the animal. We're going to put it on the altar. We're going to do all that stuff. But then we're not going to actually start the fire to do the cooking. Let's let the God cook for himself. The God who answers by fire, the God who shows that, who actually does something, that God we're going to determine is the God that we should worship. Now, this is an important contest because Baal is actually a storm god, thought to be in charge of the skies, and the images that we have of Baal, he often is standing astride like a bull with a thunderbolt in his hand. So he's, you got to kind of think of Zeus as essentially what you're getting with Baal. And so this is basically saying, okay, can Baal, let's let Baal start the fire with one of his thunderbolts. And if he does that, then good. Your people, then will worship Baal. If not, well, then maybe he's just not a real God. And then same challenge works as far as Adonai, the God of Israel. And of course, you read the story. Adonai, of course, wins that. Now, this all falls on the heels, though, of something that doesn't get quite as much discussion, but is every bit as important, and that is 1 Kings 17. And I really enjoy 17, so we're going to take a look at 17, because it starts and it says, okay, we've got, Ahav, his son becomes, Ahav, the son of Omri, and we'll just call him Ahab because it's easier. Ahab, the son of Omri, rules over Israel, all of this, and he does these things. He builds all this stuff, and he, marries Jezebel, the daughter of Baal, and he went to serve Baal and worshipped him, and he erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria, and he made the Asherah and all these different things. So some terrible things according to the narrator. And then it says, 1 Kings 17:1. Now, Elijah, the Tishbite, who was of Tishbe, or who was of the settlers in Gilead, said to Ahav, as Adonai lives, as Adonai the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, surely there will be neither dew nor rain these years except by his word. Oh wait, that's not what he says, is it? Except by my word. It's not going to rain again these years unless I say so. Not unless God says so. Unless I say so. He's claiming to have the power to control the weather. Which, you kind of have to imagine this in the context of this larger story. Who is this? We're just introduced to this guy. He's of the settlers of Gilead. We're not even sure he's a full-blown Israelite. He's a Tishbite, which might mean a native, it might mean a sojourner. In any case, he stops in, and you can just imagine this hairy guy trotting up to the king and, trotting into the king's court and saying, okay, here's what's going to happen. It's not going to rain again until I say so. You can imagine that most of the people in that court would go, okay, yeah, sure. And then word of Adonai said to him and said, okay, go east, hide yourself by the brook Cherit, which is east of the Jordan, and there you'll drink of and this is the brook, this is the word wadi, right? A wadi is one of those, we talked about it earlier in the semester. It's one of those empty, sort of a riverbed that's runs dry during the dry season, and then when you're in the wet season, it has water that runs through it, but there's no spring. It's just running from wherever the rainwater is basically coming from. So you'll drink from that. And I've commanded, and then you've got verse 4, I've commanded the ravens to provide for you there. And it says that he went and he lived by the brook Cherit, and the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening, and he would drink from the wadi. Now, ravens is interesting because the word is consonantally, it could be either ravens or Arabs. So it's not clear whether it means ravens or Arabs. Now, the vowels that we have that were added much later make it very clear that it's ravens, but, it could be Arabs. So, in terms of how this might have been read in antiquity. Now, of course, there's the joke here that, when was the last time you saw an Arab bring somebody from Israel anything, which, yeah, that's not exactly accurate. Anyway, there's lots of Arabs and Israelis these days who are friends, but, it's the sort of thing that somebody might say. But in any case, you've got, that's a worthwhile textual variant to point out. So you have miraculous preservation and provision for the prophet. And then from there, he goes to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, which is one of the allied kingdoms, along with it's one of the allied kingdoms with Ahab, because Ahab is married to the Sidonian woman. So he goes up here to Zarephath in this region, leaves the territory of Israel, and spends time with a widow there while he's waiting all this out. And in the meantime, it's not raining. And this is where, if you're a member of the king, of the king's court or whatever, you might have laughed initially, but now, it hasn't rained for a couple months. And now it hasn't rained for a year. And now you're starting to go, it hasn't rained since that weirdo came in and said it wasn't going to rain unless he said so. And so you're starting to, try to search for him. And so you have the whole story with the widow. He comes up, and ultimately the widow gets special provision, and then eventually her child dies. And Elijah raises the child from the dead, which is, kind of an impressive feat. Stretched himself upon the child and called upon Adonai and said, let this child's life return back to him. So he raises the child from the dead and presents the child to the woman. And the woman at this point says, well, now I know you are a man of God. And the extra provision, the miraculous provision of food for, over a year, I wasn't sure then. But now that you've raised my child from the dead, I'm kind of convinced that you've got something going on here. So after that, we have this contest on the mountain, on Mount Carmel. And it's worth noting, by the way, that one of the things that Elijah does when he gets up there is, first of all, he lets the other people, do their thing first, and he taunts them. I love this. As they're prophesying and they're praying toward Adonai, or they're praying toward Baal, He's taunting them, and he's saying, "Oh, wait, maybe you need to pray louder, call louder. Surely he's a god. Maybe he's occupied. Maybe he's asleep. Oh, you know what? He might be on a journey. Cry out and call out, and maybe get louder. Maybe he'll hear you." Elijah is one of my favorite biblical characters, just because he's one of the best trash talkers in the Bible, arguably the best trash talker, one of the only trash talkers. In any case, after he rebuilds the altar of Adonai, which had been torn down, he takes it and he builds it with 12 stones, according to the number of tribes of the sons of Jacob. So this is a political statement. There aren't 12 tribes in the north at this point. This is a statement that there should be unity. It's a subtle thing. So with those stones, he builds an altar, and then he makes a trench, and then he says, fill 4 pitchers with water and pour it on the burnt offering. And of course, you wonder, where is this water coming from? That'd be like pouring gold on the altar at this point, because there hasn't been rain for 3 years. So that's quite a flex here, where he says, all right, I'm so confident that this is actually going to happen here, and I want you to be sure that this is no trick. I'm gonna douse the offering with water. Maybe there's some sort of reaction going on here, right? Maybe he knows some chemistry, and you've got a water initiated reaction. Maybe not, because it says the fire of Adonai fell from heaven and consumed the burnt offering. So basically, a thunder strike falls. Lightning strikes the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust, and basically eliminates everything. And they go, yeah, Adonai, he is God. Adonai, he is the God. And then Elijah says, get the prophets of Baal. Do not let one of them escape. And they seize them, and they bring them down to the brook Kishon, and Elijah slaughters them all there. So the prophet slaughters the 450 prophets. Imagine the amount of blood. Not exactly awesome, but slaughters all of them, and this is the great victory before of Elijah, as he establishes that Adonai is the true God of Israel and is the one God that is truly living. And this whole back and forth is super important. Now, shortly after that, Jezebel basically gets her not impressed face on and says, yeah, well, I'm gonna do with you what you just did with the prophets of Baal. And he's afraid, oddly, at this point, and then takes off to Sinai and goes to meet Adonai at Sinai. And this is another episode that's worth taking a quick look at. He goes to Horeb, which is the Deuteronomistic History's word for Sinai. Remember, Horeb is also what Deuteronomy calls the mountain of God, rather than calling it Sinai. And he goes to a cave and he lodged there. Now, this should remind us of what's going on in Exodus with Moses, who is put into the cleft of a rock in a cave, and God covers Moses, and Moses then sees the glory of Moses is able to see the backside of the glory of God as Adonai passes by. So he comes to the cave and he lodges there. He stays there. So he seems to be on some sort of vision quest. He's coming to meet God. And look, see, the word of Adonai came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah answers, "I've been very zealous for Adonai, the God of hosts, for the sons of Israel, and have forsaken your covenant. They've torn down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away." And he's told, "Go forth, stand on the mountain before Adonai." And look, Adonai was passing by, and a great and strong wind was rending the mountains and breaking in pieces the rocks before Adonai. But Adonai was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But Adonai was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But Adonai was not in the fire. And after the fire, this is a tricky phrase to translate. After the fire, there's the sound of silence. That's my preferred way of translating this. Some have said a still small voice. It really is something like the sound of silence. When he hears the sound of silence, he wraps his face in his mantle, covers his face, and he goes out and stands in the entrance of the cave. And a voice came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he repeats the same answer, which is interesting. He repeats the same answer. Nothing has changed. He's seen these glorious things that God can do, but he already knows this. And it's interesting that God is not in any of those things. It's a statement about the nature of God that's worth some discussion. This is not the forum for it in terms of the asynchronous part of our lecture, but it's a worthwhile thing to think about. And when he gives that answer, Adonai says, "Okay, well, I'm going to replace you. Anoint Hazael king over Aram, Yehu the son of Nimshi king over Israel, and Elisha son of Shaphat of Avel Macholah you will anoint as prophet in your place." So, all right, well, fine, you're done. Go anoint your successor. And from that point, yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. And it's interesting that he goes in reverse order. He's told, go anoint Hazael, anoint Yehu, and anoint Elisha. And he anoints Elisha, or who we'll call Elisha, first. He never actually anoints Yehu. Yehu is anointed by one of the disciples of Elisha. And Hazael is prophesied to, is anointed effectively by Elisha. So Elijah doesn't exactly do what he's told to do here in that order, which is also a worthwhile thing to think about. But a ton of things that are really interesting. Now, Elijah then finishes his ministry by being taken up to heaven in a fiery chariot, in a chariot of fire, in a whirlwind. So he doesn't actually die. He's taken up to heaven in this way. And he remains one of the most important figures in Jewish thought. To this day, at any Passover Seder, there is a seat that is left for Elijah along with an additional cup of wine. And he also appears with Jesus in the New Testament on the Mount of Transfiguration. He is at the end of the Septuagint version, or the Christian version of the New Testament, or of the Old Testament, that is, the way that it's put together in the Greek version, a prophecy that Elijah would come before the great and terrible day of Adonai, when Adonai brings justice to the earth, is how the collection ends. So, and that's at the end of Malachi. The end of Malachi, the final book of the former prophet, or of the latter prophets, of the minor prophets in the latter prophets. The book of Malachi concludes with the prophecy that Elijah is going to come back. And there is this continued expectation among devout Jews that at some point Elijah may come back. Now, many modern Jews today have abandoned that particular part of traditional Jewish theology, but that is a part of traditional Jewish theology. Now, Elisha was Elijah's successor, and you read a bunch of those stories, a bunch of these things that are different, but that are in there. And Elisha is pretty different. Elisha is living in a house. He has a bunch of apprentices who are the sons of the prophets that it refers to, which is a phrase that we see in going back as far as 1 Samuel, that these seem to be disciples of a given prophet. But at the same point, he also does miracles just like Elijah. And actually does roughly twice as many miracles are recorded of Elisha than Elijah. And he, like Elijah, raises the dead, multiplies food. He actually makes an iron axe head float in water, purifies poison water, all sorts of different things. And these guys are not only prophesying about, ethics and different things, they have impact on the political world. So what they say ultimately impacts politics. When Elisha has one of his disciples anoint Yehu then goes and overthrows the house of Ahav and has the authority to do so and the backing of the military to do so. When the prophets say to do something, that carries weight. And at the same point, they're outside the courtly life of Israel's government. They're outside, and they're critics, and they're powerful, but and so the king doesn't really want to touch them, and probably not a good idea in general. But this prophetic critique is really important, and this establishes sort of the prototype of what the prophet is supposed to be in Israel. And that prophetic role then further develops in the later prophets that we're going to read. Now, one of the interesting things that we see is that we don't actually see in the Elijah-Elisha narrative, we stop seeing the judgment against the calves at Bethel and at Dan. Neither Elijah nor Elisha say anything negative about that, and there's no condemnation of that. They're against worship of foreign gods, of Canaanite gods, but they say nothing about how Adonai is supposed to be worshipped. It's also interesting that Elijah is perfectly okay offering a sacrifice, which then Adonai accepts by fire, on Carmel rather than in Jerusalem, which is a really interesting thing. So there's a lot of different layers here that are worth noting. But either way, these prophets essentially carry on the role of Moses in the midst of all of these things. Now, at the same point, all of what's going on externally really matters. So once we get to this stage of history, we've got a series of countries, a series of kingdoms, a series of empires that we start having to pay attention to more so. Egypt, we've already talked about as the power in the region during the reigns of David and Solomon. That starts to change by the time we get to the divided kingdom. Egypt is still powerful, but Assyria, which we're going to go ahead and zoom out here. When we look at, this is the early Assyrian Empire here. Assyria is based in Ashur here in northern Mesopotamia. Babylon is in southern Mesopotamia. But Assyria begins there and then sort of works its way out and gains control of this northern region up into Anatolia. They take the Hittites up here. And they work their way all the way down into Damascus. And so they're starting to dip down into the region that includes Egyptian control. Egypt, the Egyptian Empire kind of runs up to here. The Assyrians expand from here and work their way down, and they're starting to impinge onto that traditional Egyptian empire, which has control of this whole region through its various vassal states. Assyria begins to dip in and take control through their vassal states, and they're challenging Egyptian control of this region. Shortly thereafter, so this is when we get to Assyria, and this is around the time of Yehu. By the time we get to Yehu, and a little bit after Yehu, this is where we are. This is, say, 9th century, 8th century Assyrian Empire. So, as we get into, this is 9th century Assyrian Empire, so that's 800s. So this is what you've got. And at this point, all these other countries sort of in this region, these are pawns in the power games between these major empires, mostly Egypt and then the Mesopotamian empires. And these are states that essentially are boundary states. They're buffer states. And if you think about the Cold War, like Vietnam and Korea, that's where the US and the USSR were actually fighting their battles by proxy. You would support the group that you wanted in charge there rather than, opposing one another militarily as superpowers. The superpowers would use proxies in the power struggle. And, basically the rest of these countries at this time were sort of in a similar role. And so during this period, we start to finally see extra biblical sources begin to mention Israel and Judah. So this is good for those of us who are coming along now and we're trying to reconstruct what's happening. Now we're actually getting other statements. But it's also not so good for the people who are alive at the time. You did not want to be on the radar of Assyria or of Egypt or whatever. These are aggressive superpowers who are interested in expanding their power and their control. So when they notice you, they want you. And they want money, resources, and loyalty to help establish and support the imperial machine. And so they had, organized ways of assuring that you basically have, that you're basically going to serve them. Now, through most of the period, once we get to 900 and following, so before 900, Egypt basically controls this whole region. It's just not in question. Once you get around 900, And into the 800s, Assyria starts to dip in. And between 900 and about 600, Assyria becomes the primary empire. Assyria actually takes Egypt. This is by the time you get into the 700s. This is the what's called the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and it basically takes all of this. And so this is the situation by the time you get to the 8th century BCE. Once you get to the 700s, and so Assyria did go through some instability because basically you had dynasties would change, and each time a king died, the various vassal nations would rebel, and then the next king would have to make sure that he used his military might to basically get them all on board again. But that's what you have, is basically that empire. Now, we actually have, interestingly, on the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, who ruled from 859 to 824, this is the panel that actually says the mighty king, king of the universe, king without rival, the autocrat, the self-ruling one, the powerful one of the 4 regions of the world, receiving the tribute of Yehu, the son of Omri. And so this guy who's bowing down before the king right here is actually supposed to be Yehu, the son of Omri, which of course in the Bible, Yehu is not the son of Omri. He's actually the one who has he's eliminated the house of Omri and has established his new dynasty. But from the Assyrian perspective, they don't care. He's ruling the land of Omri, so that's what we're going to go with. So we don't know whether this is an actual depiction of Yehu or just one of his ambassadors, but basically it's saying that this is Yehu, who's bowing before the king of Assyria, offering his annual tribute. Odds are that's actually supposed to be Yehu, the king, the actual king of Israel. And so you see the bowing before the king of Assyria, who is then receiving the gifts from the kingdom of Israel at that point. Now, this is where we kind of leave off in terms of what we're going to talk about. We're going to move into some discussion of prophets and prophecy shortly. Thereafter, we're going to talk about that for Thursday stuff. I'm going to record another lecture about that very, very soon. We're going to talk about Amos, and then we're going to have a nice discussion about both on Thursday. We'll go ahead and leave off here.